Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Upside Down Kingdom, Understanding the Frozen World of the Polar Bear, presented by NatHab Expedition Leaders, Eleanor Edye and Kristina Disney. It's a pleasure to have you both with us here today. Eleanor, I'm gonna hand it off to you.
Thank you, Kendall. So happy to be here with Kristina, and so nice to see Kristina's face as well. We've worked together before in Churchill. I'm an expedition leader with Natural Habitat Adventures and have been for about 5 years now. I do most of my work in the Churchill region and have had the pleasure of spending some of that time with Kristina.
She's being modest. Actually, Eleanor was one of the people who trained me, which she left out, which I was very, very grateful for that opportunity. Yeah, so I've been working with NatHab since 2018. Love Canada's North. Love the Churchill region, such an amazing place to be able to spend time and feel so fortunate to work up there. And so we're gonna today share some of that with you guys. And actually our focus today is gonna be thinking about sea ice as an ecosystem and the processes that govern it. And so while polar bears are certainly going to be a key player, I wanna invite you throughout this presentation to think of them not just as an apex predator, but to think of them how they fill this role in this grander scheme of the entire ecosystem. And with that, let's start with the basics. So maybe a silly question, but why does ice float? You know, it's this feature about the element of water is why it becomes the sustainable feature of our planet. Next one, please, Eleanor. And so what really comes down to when we go down, really work it down to the smallest level, when we look at the molecules of water, ice floats because it doesn't reach its densest when it's a solid, but actually when it's still a liquid. So fresh water is at its most densest, 4 degrees Celsius. So if you think about it, that means that the molecules are a bit chaotic when it's warm. And as it gets cooler, they get closer and closer together. And so they actually start banging against one another. And then when you think about when they hit that 4 degrees, that's when they're so close together that it's almost like, you know what, I've had enough. It's like, you know, back in the days when we could be in crowds. Imagine crowds, you know, like I'm tired of being jostled around. And so you stick your arms out. And so that's what a hydrogen bond does. They push out, and that's when they start building, they'll spread themselves out, and that's when they start making that crystalline solid structure. And so the same thing happens to seawater. And that salt is going to depress the freezing point. So instead of freezing at 0 Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to actually freeze at around -2, which is about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which is going to form now our the form of the ice. So when ice forms in seawater, it actually makes this really beautiful, you could almost think about it like an underwater snowflake. Or you could think about it as the slush in your pop when you forget about it in the freezer. Or if you're someone living in a colder climate like Eleanor and I, when you forget your pop in -20 in the winter and you come in and you see it swishing around. But it makes this really beautiful thing. And I think there's a cool crossover here in nature for those who are from a warmer climate or maybe from a desert climate. If you've ever had the opportunity to find in nature or even in a gift shop, they call them desert roses or selenite roses. And it's what forms when you have a very salty, arid environment and the water evaporates, and they make these really beautiful crystal structures. But so from that, then they start agglomerating together. And then the next phase is going to be actually what we call pancake ice. So think about, you've got this slush, it's floating around in the ocean. And with the movement of the ocean, it's going to start sticking together sort of preferentially. And when it agglomerates, they'll make these discs. And the discs are usually, you know, maybe like half a foot thick, 10, 15 centimeters. But in size, they can vary from very, very small to, you know, a few meters, but tens of feet, 10-ish or so feet, sorry there. And then what happens actually is that because they have those bumps on the surface, when the wind blows, it catches them and it will move them throughout the ocean. And so sort of an aside quickly from the polar environment, there was a time I was working in Kenya and I was staying in a place called Lake Naivasha, and it very interestingly has papyrus swamps there, but the papyrus grows in the water, so it's a very large, they're a couple meters tall, and they look, imagine like a giant dandelion or a Dr. Seuss plant, and they grow in these nets or this mesh of hyacinth. And so I would wake up some mornings, and you'd wake up some morning and it would just be this swamp and you couldn't see the water. And then the wind would shift and you'd wake up another morning and it would just be completely clear water. And you wouldn't be able to see anything. You could just see as far as you could go. And then when I went to Churchill for the first time, it was the same thing, but with the sea ice. You could see, you'd wake up some morning and the ice would be jam-packed against your coast, and the wind would shift and it would blow it back out. And I know for myself, I remember the first time seeing that broken ice in the waves was so impactful because there's so much power. And I know, Eleanor, did that, like, for me, that was a really big first impression. But for you, do you remember the first time you saw the ice in the waves?
I sure do. I'd spent some time in Churchill, and then the first time I came up in the fall, and we were talking about this earlier, and I'd forgotten the key part of my first time seeing this ice, is that we used to have a staff member who would go surfing in these ice-packed waters. And the very first time I saw the huge waves crashing that were full of ice, there was also a guy on a surfboard trying to get through that ice too.
That is wild. Oh my goodness. Wow. Yeah, there's a narrow window that you can pull that off with, because over time, what's going to happen is it's actually going to pack in and it will freeze in. But that's so cool that that they brought the surfboard up. So we call those, that pack ice will form in, and so those ice flows, they'll actually can bang together, and sometimes we'll call them pressure ridges. So imagine you're looking out over the frozen ocean, and sometimes you'll see in the distance, like, it looks like something sticking out, and really it's because the ice has ramped itself up in broken pieces, and they can be like tens of feet into the air. And also, just a quick aside, so take a moment if you'd like to look around. So on there's the names of different forms of ice in English, but they are also accompanied by the names in Inuktitut for the Inuit who live there. And when you think about it, they have so many names for snow and ice because of their familiarity with it. For myself, I make the comparison, I grew up on a farm, and we knew, if like the big almond tree in the backyard, if that was shifting with the wind, then like it was going to be one crazy rainstorm coming in. And so it's that familiarity of spending so much time in an ecosystem, you really get to know these really beautiful details. And I just have a lot of respect for that. But so far what I've talked about is how ice forms when you have a turbulent condition. So now we're going to switch and just show you that there's a comparison when you have a calm ocean. The ice will actually form in a slightly different manner. So if you have the rough seas, it's going to go through that process on the left, from pancaking to rafting, and then eventually into what we think of with that sheet ice. It's what we come to mind when we imagine a polar bear walking across a frozen desert, that is, or the frozen desert of the Arctic. We think of that sheet ice, but there's processes to get there. And then if it's on the calm side, it's going to form what's called nihilus ice, which we can see on the next slide. And that's probably more familiar to those of us listening in from colder climates, those that fall freeze up when we're either the puddles in our yard or the lake, and it gets that first thin veneer, that really satisfying thing as a kid, and even now as an adult, when you go and you step on that first layer of ice and you hear the crunch and the hiss and the bubbles come up. And so that's when it first freezes. And over time, if that ice survives into the next season, then it's going to be what we call multi-year ice. And so multi-year ice essentially means it's made it through the first season, and it's you could almost say it's become more stable. And something that I never realized until I started living and working in the north is that ice is self-insulating. So, for example, if you have ice that's about a foot thick or foot and a half thick, so 20 centimeters or so, that ice, as it under cooling temperatures, can keep adding more to itself at about 5 centimeters. So a few inches per day, it'll keep expanding aerial wise very quickly. But if ice is, say, a meter thick, so if it's 2-3 feet thick, then it's only going to grow at 1 centimeter because it has so much energy locked away in those bonds. And so then the same thing is going to apply in reverse, which is where this really kind of, I think, drives home for myself. So that means that if you have thin ice, it's going to melt more quickly. And if you have thicker ice, it's going to melt more slowly. And so we can actually see that in this next graph to sort of visualize this. So this shows you trends roughly from about the 80s in extent per area. I think it's million square miles there, up until around the present. And so you can see that the amount of first ice through the years stays roughly the same. But if you look, especially there in the bottom left, so the amount of 4th year ice, 5th year ice, that really long-term stages, that's that's gone into decline, especially in the last 15 to 20 years. And so far I've been talking to you guys about the aerial extent of how ice is formed, but now I want to actually go into depth, or the cross section of it. So ice being freshwater, what happens is that those ice crystals, they actually dispel the salt between them. So those crystals start to bond, and when they do that, it's almost like they bully out. Think about those hydrogen bond elbows getting thrown again. They bully out the salt from between their crystal structure. And so the older ice gets, actually, the fresher it is, which is an interesting thing. So there's still a little bit of salt still when an ice early forms, and then that multi-year ice will actually have a lower salt content. And there's a couple of consequences of ice becoming fresher, which is that the first is that these brine channels are going to get formed. So it pushes the salt out, and so the salt still stays mixed with water, but it gets a very, very high concentration. And so those brine channels, what they do is they actually flow through, and they're going to shift down, and they actually sink through into the water column and go down. And so that it's a cartoon here on the right side, but that's sort of hexagon image is actually like a mass spectrometry photo of what those brine channels look like on a very, very micro level. So you can sort of see that, like, the crystals stay there and that flows through. And what I think is really amazing is that this is the foundation for some of the hardiest little organisms that survive on this earth and start producing things, which is where I'm going to pass it off to Eleanor.
Thanks, Kristina, because I'm going to bring us now a conversation about the organisms themselves that live in this area. And the picture I picked to introduce this section is doesn't look like much, right? And this was on purpose, because if you fly over sea ice, be it in the spring, the winter, or in the fall, as it's just starting to form, you look down and you go, huh, that looks like a whole bunch of nothing. But let's remember that ultimately what we're getting ourselves to is the polar bear here, and we know that there are other organisms that live and use this habitat as well. I also picked this photo with this combination of melting ice and open water to remind us as we move through this that this is an extremely dynamic ecosystem. It's over a very large area in the very northern reaches. We might get that multi-year ice that Kristina was talking about. It's very thick, doesn't change very much year to year. But then we get areas like Hudson Bay, where NatHab runs polar bear tours, where you have a complete annual melt and refreeze of the entire bay area. So a lot of dynamism, and all the organisms that live in these areas have to be able to navigate these shifting conditions as well. So what I've got here is it's a food web, okay, showing us the food web of the Arctic. And I happen to have two kids, one of whom was doing food webs in school last year when he came home with all this work, and I looked at it and went, ha! Because when we start learning about food webs, it's usually in grade school, and they're usually incredibly simplified. If we think about all the species that live somewhere like a tropical rainforest, try drawing that out on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. It's never going to fit, because it's such an interconnected ecosystem with so many relationships and so many species. However, when we are talking about the Arctic, we actually can usually draw out all those relationships on a single piece of paper, because it is a fairly simplified food web. There are fewer species than and fewer relationships compared to places like a rainforest or like a lower latitude forest. But I do want you to keep several things in mind. Firstly is that just because there aren't as many species doesn't mean that we can't see diversity in other ways. For example, if you're looking at a square meter of a rainforest, it might have 600 species of insects, but there are only a handful of individuals of each species. Whereas in the Arctic, we have about 2 million ring seals. There is a lot of genetic diversity within all those individuals, even if we don't have that many species of seal. The other thing I want to draw your attention to in this photo here is that it's really bringing us into mind that, again, this is a dynamic ecosystem with changes. A lot of the organisms we can see here, specifically the whales and the birds, they're migratory. They come in throughout the summer, and they're going to leave again in the winter when conditions get really harsh. But they are moving back and forth within this ecosystem. We can also see that there are animals that come onto the ice sometimes, right? So things like the Arctic fox spend a lot of their year on land, but do come onto the ice during the winter as well, following behind the polar bears. And the polar bears are, again, they're another place of diversity where polar bears might spend their entire lifespan on ice, on that marine system, or they might be migrating back and forth between the land when that ice melts and coming back onto that seasonal ice. I did also want to point out that the primary producers here, so those little tiny plants, the algae that's producing the carbon and the oxygen for all of these organisms, can be located in a couple of different places. So I'm going to take us through briefly here some of these primary producers, and firstly, because I think we sometimes forget about the little things, when in fact those little things are the base of everything that exists. The base, if you want a polar bear, you got to have a whole bunch of these. This is a species of algae called a Dinoflagellate. The genus name is Pernidiella, and it is associated with cold water. So it's found in open cold water and in association with sea ice. You may know of this grouping if you live somewhere coastal that's prone to red tides. This is the same group of organisms that does cause red tides, though we don't tend to see those up in the Arctic. In our next slide, I want to show you another kind of Arctic algae. This is called a diatom. You may have heard of this because of diatomaceous earth. So we use this in our garden. And that image there on the right that looks like a magnifying glass or something like that is actually the silica skeleton of that algae. Now, what I find fascinating about these guys is that we're used to thinking maybe about algae in the water. And I think about it that way too. But here we're really talking about the marine system. We're talking specifically about that sea ice. So on that left-hand side, take a look at that ice core. So they drilled down into that annual sea ice, and you can see that ring along the bottom of the core where it is stained. And it's not stained by like dirty runoff or polar bear pee or anything like that. That is actually a colony of those diatoms that are growing within that sea ice. So here's where we come to that upside down thinking, because I want you to think about the sea ice as a platform where we're always looking underneath and thinking of that underneath of that sea ice as the template, the soil where that garden can grow. And what does it look like when you're actually under the water? Well, you might not think as a human that it looks very interesting or attractive. This is an underwater shot of what those diatoms and what those sea algae will look like when they are growing underneath that ice. So it's not a whole lot to look at, right? Like, think about it as the primary means of supporting an ecosystem. How does it compare to what you see out your window right now, to whatever landscape, whether it's farmers' fields, whether it's forests? It's very, very different, but no less important and essential for that habitat. And just to give you an idea about how essential it is, this is just a global map looking at primary productivity around the globe every year. And primary productivity is just a measurement of how much carbon dioxide those plants are taking in, fixing as sugar or starch, and then releasing oxygen. So it's showing us how much of that metabolism is happening. And I want you to look specifically at the oceans and look at how those tropical oceans are darker in color. That's telling us that those tropics are actually not producing as much products of photosynthesis as those higher latitude polar regions. I think that's really cool. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. You know, we think of those high Arctic areas as pretty barren, but in fact, they are the gardens of the world. And they get, of course, in the northern hemisphere, they're going to get 24-hour sunlight in our summer. In the Antarctic, they're going to get that 24-hour sunlight in their summer. But also that there is a higher concentration of nutrients available for those tiny little plants in those regions. And this is why we see organisms making use of those high latitude regions, and why we see mammals and birds migrating there. Doesn't seem like there's a lot going on there. It looks fairly barren to the eye, but it is a hot spot if you're looking to eat pretty quickly. And just to show you that, of course, this is present through the winter underneath the sea ice, but in those areas where that ice melts annually, you do also get sea ice, you do also get algal blooms as that ice melts. So this is an image of what an algae bloom can look like from space. This is north of Norway, so this would be iced over in the winter. And then in the summer, when that long summer sun hits and we start to get that nutrient upwelling, feeding and fertilizing the area, we get all those millions and billions of tiny little plants growing in the area. And let's run through the food chain. What feeds on that? Well, some really fun, kind of ugly, depending on your perspective, things. So these are 3 different species of a group called the Copepods. So they kind of look like little shrimp. They're somewhat related. They are, if you've ever heard of krill, this is one of the kinds of things that krill is made of. A common name for these guys are Arctic feed, and they are an important food source from anything from fish, seabirds, as well as marine mammals. And what makes this so important in the food chain is that it's a very good condenser of all the energy coming from that algae. If you look at the middle of all of these little guys here, you'll see what looks like a shiny silver bubble in the middle. And these are the fat reserves of this copepod. Now, just like the polar bear, just like the beluga whale, just like any other organism that remains in the Arctic year-round, they rely heavily on storing fat to get them through that long Arctic winter. So that fat is what they need to survive over the winter, but it's also what makes them very attractive as a prey source for all the things that are going to feed on them. And the biggest thing that's going to feed on them is this animal here, the bowhead whale. I talked about whales last week when I was talking about some whales of Quebec. I didn't talk about this guy, but it's so fascinating. It is the only baleen whale endemic to the Arctic. It is, we think, the longest lived mammal in the world. It can live over 200 years and grows to over 50 feet long. As a filter feeder, it does require that massive head, so the head can be up to 1/3 the length of its body, and it can consume and will consume up to 2 tons of those little tiny organisms every day to keep that massive mouth fed. Now, who else eats these guys? Well, some fish do. This is the polar cod. They're not as big and as exciting as the whale, but they're really important for the food chain. They've got some super cool reproduction going on. So just like a lot of other organisms, they have to time their reproduction so that the state of the world is correct for their fry to go off and have the best chance of surviving. And with them, they time their egg hatch based on the salinity of the water that surrounds them. So as the ice starts to melt in the spring, the fresh water will start to change that salt concentration as it melts, tells the eggs to hatch. Now, keep in mind with these fish, you can see them in this picture, right? That they are swimming in and amongst ice. And like Kristina said, that salt water has a lower freezing point than fresh water does. So these fish might well be swimming in water that are below the freezing point. And how they survive those kinds of conditions is a really fascinating thing that Kristina actually shared with me, and I'm going to let her share with you as well.
Yeah. So I just stumbled upon this pretty recently, and the studies from a couple years ago. So in the top left there, you'll see that's the polar cod once again, living in our Arctic. But in the bottom right, that's what's called a bald nanothin, and those are actually, nautothin. And so those actually live in Antarctica, and there's a lab that studied them in the 1990s because both fish are capable of this really, I think, phenomenal feat in that they produce their own antifreeze in their blood. Because they're living in these sub-zero temperatures, they can't afford to have the molecules of their blood crystallize. It would mean the end of their survival. And so essentially they have a very simple protein. It's only made out of 3 pieces, you could think about it as a threonine and 2 alanines, which, setting that aside, the nickname for this protein is Tra-la-la, which I think is hilarious. And so that's what stops their blood from congealing and essentially freezing them to death. And so this was studied, the nautothins were studied in Antarctica. And then eventually someone did a study on the polar cod. And so they found the same protein, but the lab in Antarctica was studying not just the protein, but the genetics behind the protein. And so what they were trying to find out is, okay, this fish has a very special use for this. How did it get it? And so what they did was they actually went through the DNA and they tracked down where they thought this combination of this tralala came from. And so they found out that for the nautothins, it came from a digestive enzyme that it had, and it changed that in order so that it could live in this really cold environment. And so then when they found out this exact same protein existed in the polar cod, the same lab was like, hey, let's look at that. Let's see if it's the same story. And they were mind blown because it wasn't. It had nothing to do with the digestive enzyme. And in fact, it took them 20 years to track down where this came from. So think about like trying to read a dictionary. That's what the equivalent that they were doing. They have the genetic code, and somewhere in this genetic code is the root word for that protein. And so it took them 20 years to figure it out because it didn't make any sense. And eventually where they found it, quote unquote, where in the DNA was what we would call a pile of junk. It wasn't for digestion. It wasn't for reproduction. It wasn't for nerves. But when we have our DNA, there's sections of it that are all tacked together, and it comes with the next piece. So when our DNA gets transferred over, even though it might not be applied to that, it's why, you know, hair color is associated with this trait, because these different traits all come and go together. And the reason the polar cod developed this was because this pile of junk, quote unquote, from the lab got transferred with it, and eventually through duplication, mutation, and all that relocation, it just mutated into the equivalent thing. And so I like to joke that these Pisces from two different poles are this amazing example of coevolution, because we've come to identical proteins but sourced in a completely different way. But
And
of course,
all
these
I
are both
think about
snacks.
all I think about is how many grad students spent their years combing through that DNA.
Yep.
But to come back to the food chain, what feeds on the polar cod? Well, we have a number of seals in the Arctic, one of which is this ring seal that we can see here. This is one of the primary food sources of the polar bear that we'll get to as well. But there are other things that eat the seal besides the polar bear, one of which is the walrus. Now, the walrus eats a bunch of different things, everything from mollusks, shrimp, tube worms, corals, but they also do eat seals. And I wouldn't want to talk about the Arctic food web without including a walrus, because they are beautiful. But here we have some images of a bunch of different marine mammals found in the Arctic. And what do they all have in common? Well, we've got the walrus, we've got the beluga whale, we have the bowhead, the bowhead, we've got the ring seal, we've got a narwhal. Well, they're all mammals. They all live in the Arctic. Some of them will migrate up. They all kind of feed at the same level of the food web, but mostly what I want to draw your attention to is what ultimately feeds on them. And of course, this takes us to the very top of our food chain, the polar bear, sometimes known as the king of the Arctic, because they will basically eat whatever crosses their path, has enough fat for them to make it worth it. And we know that they will eat pretty well anything that serves those needs. So they are supremely interwoven into the food web. All the while, you can think of them as living really at that interface of the ice and the ocean. So with this, what I want to do is hand things back over to Kristina to talk about changes that have been observed in that sea ice. And I know that both she and I are going to be talking as we go along, mostly about Hudson Bay, because it's taken very much as an early sign of some of the changes that we're seeing in the Arctic. It's fairly far south. It's already covered by annual ice, so it does lose its ice every summer. And it's a very well-studied area, so we have lots of good information to share about that.
Thanks, Eleanor. Just to forewarn everyone, I really love maps. I've reined myself in. I only put a couple in here, but I started in geography, so that's my background. And so I like to bring you guys the most up-to-date information that I possibly can. So if you look at the map on the left-hand screen here, that's from May 8th. So just this weekend, that's the select areas that the Canadian government is monitoring. And so we can see those green, that is actually representing medium layer of thick ice, and that light blue is where it's opening up. So those are areas that are being tracked by Environment Canada. And then the photo in the center is actually from April 18th. So that's a photo from NASA. And the reason why that one was taken was because April 15th this year was marked as the year where there was official signs that Hudson Bay was starting its spring breakup, which in context is quite early. And so we're starting to see different changes in that. And remember, it'll fluctuate every year, but there is a trend that I want to bring your attention to. But before we can understand that trend, I want to sort of bring us into what are all the forces that drive the formation and the breakup of ice throughout the seasons. And so our context and our understanding of sea ice formation used to be, I think, quite simple. Essentially, we have winds coming down from the north, and those winds are bringing colder air temperatures. They're going to drive part of the current, and so it's bringing that coolness, and it's going to bring it and freeze into Hudson Bay. But we've started to see next that is more complicated than I think we originally understood. And so it's still that general pattern. So in central Canada, we always have these predominant northwesterly winds coming down, but only recently we have learned that small variances that make a really big difference in the ice that takes place in Hudson Bay. So if the winds tend to be stronger from the north out of that northwest mix, then actually ice gets thicker in Hudson Bay in the western side. So it forms asymmetrically. So the west side can actually, there'll be thicker ice on one side or the other. And out of then in reverse, if it's, or not reverse, sorry, if it's the westerlies, then what happens is that the ice gets pushed more so to the east side of Hudson Bay. And that difference is significant. That can be a 0.5 meter an average difference. So you've got about 1.5 foot difference between the east and west side, which to you and I may not seem super significant, but in time, that can measure to almost 30 days difference in when the ice will break up, which is going to have a very large effect. So then that takes care of the wind component, but there's also other factors that play in. So there is a counterclockwise current that takes place in Hudson Bay. So it comes in from the western side, goes down and circles through. And in general, this is still true. But again, through further study, the last couple of years, people have really delved into Hudson Bay as far as to what's going on. And I think we've just got a bit of a lag here. So we'll see in this next slide that it actually changes for spring and summer. So, or sorry, summer versus fall. So in the fall, we still have that general, as we've understood it, this counterclockwise current going. But in the summertime, there's a shift, and that shift is because of a change in winds, as well as the influx of fresh water from rivers flowing into Hudson Bay. So what happens in the summertime is that the western side of Hudson Bay retains its counterclockwise flow and sort of becomes a smaller cyclone. And then on the east, it actually becomes clockwise as the fresh water from the rivers comes in and changes the current pattern because of the contribution to density. So thinking about when that fresh water comes in, it's going to change that freezing point, right? So the fresh water would freeze at 0 or 32, and our salt water would freeze around -2. So when that fresh water hits, it's going to change the way it freezes in the fall. And this has a big effect, and it also is what all of this comes together to make the reason that Churchill is such a phenomenal place. So it's all these forces coming together to one specific location. So one, we've still got those northwest winds. So regardless, they're going to drive that cold ice in the fall. We have the clockwise currents that are retained throughout the western side of Hudson Bay, sort of represented by my white arrows there. You can think about it almost causes a back eddy. So we have the large coming down, but then because it hits that shelf of land, that's the next reason. It's going to cause a back eddy. So it hits that and it'll spiral there. So you have the seawater spiraling there, and then icing on the cake, we have the Churchill River, which flows in and brings that and actually makes it so that the ice will freeze there first out of anywhere in the whole bay. And so we know that, but we're not the only ones to know that. The bears certainly know this, and I would argue that they knew it long before we did. And it's really important to them because the amount of time that they spend on land, right? Because they don't live in the high Arctic, so they have to come to land when that ice melts. And so their time on land is a period of fasting. They have to survive off of their fat reserves that they gained from seal hunting in the spring. And so we can see in the next slide that those breakup dates are trending. So if you look on the left-hand side, so it's just measured in total number of days, so rather than splitting up into months. So we can see that as we're shifting from the 70s into around the 2010s, we're getting closer to what we observed this year, that April breakup date. But that used to be happening in June, when 30, 40 years ago. And then if we look at the freeze up date in the fall, that date's becoming later and later. It's getting pushed into November. It's getting pushed sometimes into December. And so that means that extended period is time those polar bears really have to use up their own body mass. And so that affects not just them as an individual, but their resilience as an overall species and as a population. So that's specific to our Hudson Bay bears. But now if we take a moment and take a step back and look at the grander scheme of sea ice, so the right-hand side, that is sea ice as of May 5th. So you can sort of see where we're at. And then on the left-hand side is a breakdown of our polar bear populations into subpopulations. Please take this somewhat with a grain of salt or allow for some wiggle room. We as humans love to divide things and put things in boxes. And just because these lines are drawn on this map does not mean that they are hard set, territorial boundaries. Polar bears will migrate through, genetics will change. These are just some general groupings that we use mostly for management, is where it really kicks in. So I want you, if you can, we're gonna take a moment, look at those, and either zone in on an area or pick one, because on the next one I'm going to show an animation, and the animation is actually going to go through. I think should have enough time to switch over to that. So this animation is going to go through the changes in sea ice, I think somewhere around the 80s or 90s up until almost present day, I think until 2016. And so while you watch this, try and keep in mind some of those populations, right? So if that's their general territory where they're migrating through, then the sea ice is going to change, right? That may be where they're from, but they're going to have to adapt to it. And so when I see things, getting her going there? No, that's all good. So I'll just go through this really quickly. The animation would have shown as there's a shift, and you can watch it move. I think, yeah, there's a few different ways to find this, but we'll come back to that. The idea being that the drive home message for me is that they live in a place where, imagine your street signs don't stay the same. Imagine you wake up one morning and the street signs are completely different. Your neighbor's car isn't parked there anymore. And so it's always changing. And that's what the sea ice is like to live on as a polar bear or as an Arctic fox. So it's like always being on a conveyor belt or a walkway at an airport. The ice is going to be continually drifting and shifting, and that might not be the best hunting ground. So they're always having to relocate back to where they need to be. The other thing is that the sea ice, that multi-year ice gets smaller and smaller, and so those breakups changes. And it doesn't just affect polar bears, it affects a whole slew of species. So again, we've got that bowhead whale. The bowhead, for the first time in the winter of 2018 and 2019, there were populations that didn't migrate out of the Arctic. That's never been recorded before. Normally they have to leave because even though they have a very thick skull and they can actually break ice that's less than about 1 meter thick. So a few feet thick, they're capable of breaking, but there has to be cracks in it. And normally winter ice, the freeze up is so bad, they have to leave and find other hunting grounds, but they were able to stay. Another impact is that orcas from the south are moving up, and because the Arctic Ocean is starting to almost have more Atlantic characteristics. And with that, that means that species that were never hunted before by orcas are now being predated upon, specifically narwhal, which is going to change that dynamic. Smaller fish species like the sockeye salmon is being caught in the Arctic archipelago, which has never been known before. Atlantic cod are starting to exist in the same places as polar cod, whereas before their species barely overlapped. And so these shifting ranges, they really show an uncertain future. But I think it's important that this is a really opportunity that we can take a responsible and an active role in those changes, whether as an individual or organizations, which is why I wanted to pass over to Eleanor to show some of that. Oh, I think you're still muted, Eleanor.
Try again, am I on now?
You certainly are.
Okay, great. Sometimes it just needs to be toggled twice. So thanks for that. And yeah, I want to take some time to talk about some conservation measures now. There are so many grassroots organizations that work on conservation of species around the globe. And we could sit here and we could talk for literal days about all the things that are being done to protect the Arctic in general and bears specifically. So I'm really just going to touch on some of the really big, massive things that are happening at a landscape level for conservation. Because if we really dial down to the basis of all conservation measures, there are two main themes that come up, right, as to how we can protect ecosystems and species. So first thing, like, don't go out and kill the animals that you're trying to protect. That's number one. Whatever you're doing, don't go out and directly kill them. Don't do things that will kill them. Don't do things that will harm them or stop their reproduction. But the second thing that needs to happen for these species to survive and thrive is that they actually need their habitat to remain. And we know that the polar bear, as well as all the other species we've talked about, from the phytoplankton, the algae, all the way through to the polar cod, to the narwhal, they all need that sea ice. And the polar bear needs all those species. So to truly conserve the polar bear, we have to first start thinking about, well, how can we go about saving them space on this planet? So one of the main initiatives of WWF, as well as our local government here in Canada, has been to identify, as we look into the future and we know that ice trends are going in the wrong direction, so we're getting less and less ice every year, not just in volume, but also in thickness. If we look at this and we look at the Arctic, at some point there's going to be an area that is the last ice standing. Where is it going to be? So this area has been identified by research teams as being located, you can see on the left-hand side that white outline, that is what we call the last ice area. And the area specifically that you can see on the right-hand image, north of Ellesmere Islands, that green splotch, has been named by the Canadian government as a marine protected area. So this area, traditionally the name was translated as the place where the ice never melts. So this has historically been an area that has had very, very thick multi-year ice. And if you were to go look at a map of polar bear populations right now, or if you toggle back to the one Kristina just showed, you'd see that there is a bear population there. But if you looked at the numbers, you'd say, that's not a lot of bears. Why aren't there many bears living there right now? And it's because that multi-year ice is actually very, very poor bear habitat. They can't hunt from there. The seals don't use the area. But as that ice continues to thin, we anticipate that that area that has now been set aside as a conservation space will actually be prime bear habitat into the future. And this is all being done in the hope that when we look 100, 200, 500 years out, when humans have done a better job of controlling our impact on the environment, we look to a time when we might be able to have more ice again, that the species that could then recolonize the re-iced areas will still have that refuge that they can be coming back from. So that's one really big piece. So keeping that habitat safe. Now, I want to talk about another big impact that humans have been having on the Arctic region. And this is one that I think a lot of us don't think about. I know I don't think about it, although it does seem, I said to my husband last night when I was working on this, I came out and said, you know, every time I start talking about bears, somehow I end up talking about hydroelectricity. And what do those two things have in common? Well, more than you would think, okay? There is, I'm going to draw the line between the generating station that you can see here and polar bears. So let's start. Globally, we know that a lot of large rivers are used as for hydroelectricity generating. Only about a third of the world's large rivers are free flowing. Those are usually in very, very remote areas. And even though a lot of these rivers that flow into Hudson Bay and into the Arctic Ocean are also remote, they have been utilized tremendously as a hydroelectric resource. And Hudson Bay is really being looked at right now as a case study in how this human impact on the rivers can have much more far-ranging effects than we ever thought it could be having on bears. So the Hudson Bay watershed is huge. It covers nearly half of North America, has lots of large rivers, a lot of hydroelectric generating stations in development. Along the Nelson River, which is the one that I live closest to, there are 5 current stations, 1 that is in construction and another dozen planned out to be happening in the future. La Grande Rivière has another 12 already built, and they're planning on another 25. So we're talking big, big impact on the ecosystems here. And the picture here is, this is, I think, Kelsey generating station. So this is one of the first ones that was built along the Nelson River. And you can see that behind the dam, they have constructed a very, very large reservoir so that they always have a supply of fresh water to move through that generating station to make electricity. Now, I'm going to get to what this has to do with bears because there are steps, there are connections that we need to make. Now, to start off with Hudson Bay, so we have the map of Hudson Bay on the left, and this is a depth map that you can see. So even though it looks like Hudson Bay is pretty deep because it's shown in blue, if you look at the scale, it's only, what do we go up to, 200 meters deep? It's only about 600 feet. This is a very, very shallow sea with a lot of movement and turnover. And the freshwater interface, like Kristina was saying, there's a lot of fresh water that dumps into the system that has a major impact on ice formation. Now, in a natural free-flowing river, that freshwater dump primarily occurs in spring and summer. So it's the meltwater that comes off all that snow-covered landscape and then those summer rains. Throughout the winter and fall, that freshwater output tends to be quite a bit lower. That freshwater, as it gets dumped into the Hudson Bay system, that freshwater, it's less dense and it's warmer and it tends to sit on top of Hudson Bay. This is counter to how it works when sea ice freezes up. Like Kristina was saying, when sea ice is being formed, we have it dropping down below that freezing point. Ice forms, brine gets pushed out, and as that brine is very, very dense and very, very cold, it sinks down to the bottom of the water column, forcing fresh water up again. So when ice forms, it actually creates this very large mixing effect on the ecosystem. And that mixing is critically important for nutrients to come up, therefore algae to grow, therefore copepods and fish and polar bears and seals to feed. And without that mixing, we lose out on that fertilizing event. So on the right-hand side, the thick gray line kind of in the top middle shows you what the river flows are now that a hydroelectric dam has been put in. Well, more than one, at least 6 so far. It is even throughout the course of the year. So whether we're talking January or June, the output of fresh water into Hudson Bay has now been equalized across the year. Now, what does that mean? This is hard. People are still really working on this, but we know it's having an impact. Way back in the 1950s, when they started building these dams, the thought was that it didn't actually have an impact at all, that it was such a small drop in this proverbial bucket, that it would have no difference. But we are going on and we are seeing that it is having a big effect on how that ice is formed, how productive that ecosystem is, and therefore maybe even how many bears that ecosystem can support. So once this started to be realized that this was a very large question that had not been answered, and that humans are really having incredibly large-scale landscape impacts on this prime polar bear habitat, I will say that we have gone out and we're doing our best to find the answers to what this could mean. So there has been a large-scale study started in 2017. This is funded by Manitoba Hydro, our local hydroelectric company, as well as 5 different university teams. It's a huge topic, and their goal is to decouple, so to pull apart the effects of climate change from the effects of all of this freshwater dumping that's been going on into Hudson Bay. And this is an ongoing project that's very expensive, yet very well funded. And some of the early data that is coming out is saying that it's possible that this extra water that's been going in at different times of year has actually delayed the days where bears can get onto the ice. So maybe instead of the ice freezing on November 15th, that the effect of all this fresh water actually means that it might be freezing up November 20th. So to us, it seems like just a few days, but for a bear, that's a whole extra few days that they're not getting to eat. And like you were saying, at a population level, that can have real effects. The flip side of this is that it also is showing that by removing that freshwater pulse in the spring, that it might actually be keeping the ice on Hudson Bay longer in the springtime, therefore allowing bears to feed longer into the spring. So big questions, huge questions to which we don't yet have full answers, but I'm really, really excited to see what kind of answers can come out of this, and whether it's even in fact possible for us to take that knowledge and take that landscape level modifications that we have done and use it for a power of good for those bears. You know, maybe moving forward, we might see that more of our generating stations are like this one that I've got up here. That's what's called a run of rivers. So there's no reservoir, the water just runs straight through, so there's no change in the seasonality. Or we might find that we can actually play around a little bit and create a better habitat for those bears, more like what they would have had 50 or 60 years ago before carbon dioxide started to increase so drastically in the atmosphere. So it's very, very big questions, all coming down to these bears and what we can do to maintain their ecosystem and to make sure that they do have habitat, whether it's this year or 20 years or 100 years in the future. So I'd like to just kind of take this moment to remind us and to kind of rethink about how we look at the ice. Don't look at it as a blanket of nothing. Look at it and think about all that's growing on it. Think about all that is supported by it. Think about how all of this needs to exist for us to have these bears, and just you know, changing our perspective a little bit. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'll turn it over to Kendall for any questions that have come up.
Great, thank you so much. We've got a quiet crowd today, so I do encourage anyone who has a question to submit their questions in their control panel under that question field. Thank you so much, ladies. That was really fascinating. It's such a complex topic, and you presented it so well. So thank you very much. So we've got a couple questions here. First one is, can you talk just a little bit more about the marine protected area and how it's actually protected?
Sure. Do you want? Maybe I'll take that one, Kristina, if that's okay. And yeah, just before I even get into that, I will say that this is I think when we bit this off as a topic, we thought this would be something that we already had a lot of knowledge about, and we could update our knowledge and come to you with a really solid presentation. And we kind of both got punched in the face with how much science has happened in the past 12 months of our updating our knowledge. And sometimes science just comes and does that to you. So that marine protected area, all of our marine protected areas in Canada are they are administered by Parks Canada. So whether it's a marine area or whether it's a terrestrial area, they all fall under the Federal Park Service. And each marine protected area will be evaluated and judged about what can happen. I do know that up in this area, it is an area that has, it's very much an area that's been traditionally used by local people. So the Inuit people do have a long history of use of the area. So we will be able to continue seeing, you know, people still accessing the area for traditional uses, but it will be closed to things like commercial vessels, including oil shipping or anything else like that, as well as any other commercial activities that might have an impact on that habitat or on that land. So we've done a really good job, I think, in Canada about looking at those marine protected areas and actually protecting them and enforcing those regulations. So I'm feeling quite hopeful about that area being an effective and safe area for those bears.
Great. So if bears leave an area because there's no ice, why would they return back to that same place to live in the future?
I can take this one if you want.
Sure.
Sure. So the ice, if you think about the ice is a platform for what's beneath. And so the reason the bears are, you can imagine ice is very extensive, but the bears are going specifically to where the seals or their food source are feeding, right? And the seals are going to exist depending on a depth profile underneath, because there's essentially what you could call dead zones, right? There's a point where you get too deep and there's less for them to thrive off of, and so there's sort of a happy medium that they're searching for. And so a bear might have to leave that area because there's no ice for them to hunt from, but they'll go back there if they know that that's where there's still a feeding ground, right? So the ice is the in-between for them to access their food source, if that helps clear that up for them.
Sure. On that topic, someone asked if there's currently enough ice for the total number of polar bears.
I mean, at a short answer, I would say yes. There are all the bears that are out on the ice right now are supported by the amount of ice that is there. So, you know, we do see that while we look at the global polar bear population, firstly, they're really hard to count. It's very difficult to get completely accurate population measurements of polar bears, but the ones that have been done, they always show some fluctuation. But we do have a fairly robust global population, and it doesn't seem to be substantially decreasing even right now when we see these changes in ice conditions. Some of what we do see are, you know, less reproduction, smaller bears, but the actual numbers of bears have not changed significantly over the past 5 to 10 years.
And then just to follow up with that, ice is one of those things that it's almost measuring the area isn't where the value is. It's almost more on a temporal scale, and how that's going to subsist. And then also following up with the population dynamics, just leading off of what Eleanor said. So when you're seeing those smaller bears and those smaller cub rates, that is a precursor to a population shift in dynamics, because they can't sustain themselves at a current level. And so if you think about it as that U-shaped threshold, they're going to fall out of a current place and have to reestablish somewhere else. So even though the numbers of populations of bears aren't, it's again, that's population resilience is a huge part of their stable ecology, I'd say.
How much of an impact is the changing in ice having on seals?
Population dependent. It's the worst word to say. I don't mean to keep using that, but again, so when I was talking about those dead zones, so if you think about a seal, and this is where it can feed, right? You've got however far distance from that intertidal zone, or not intertidal zone, but there's a distance and a depth that they can feed at. And so if the ice only exists at the center where there's no room for them to feed, they have much further to travel in between feeding and resting. Because they do go on the ice to rest, right? That's that other stage. That's where they have their pups. And so if you're stressing out that system, if they can't easily reach between feeding ground and ice content, or if that relationship gets lost entirely. Eleanor, anything? I was trying to think of another relationship there.
Yeah, I know that the ring seal has been identified as a species of concern, not necessarily because that their numbers are dropping significantly, but because they are such an ice-reliant species, they will den and pup directly on the ice shelf. So without that ice platform that extends into the spring, they won't have the opportunity to reproduce. That being said, we're not seeing those big shifts in the global population at the moment. We just know that as we see less ice, there will simply be less habitat for those seals as well.
Do you know if hydroelectric companies are working with or willing to work with environmentalists on this issue?
Ooh, that's a big question. I think there are so many hydroelectric companies, and I know in Canada it's done province by province, so our local territories like that, and each one is more, has a different threshold about what they're willing to to do for the environment versus what they're willing to do for their stakeholders. But we do recognize that part of the reason people look towards hydroelectric power is that we do see it as a more sustainable option. And so if we can add on to that sustainability without decreasing significantly the amount of electricity produced, or without having a major impact on the service that's provided to the electric customer, I think a lot of people and organizations really see it as a win-win. You know, make the world better while your day-to-day doesn't change that much. That's what we really like to see. I can't speak for anything happening around in Russia or elsewhere. I don't know if you have any more information about that, Kristina.
No, it'd be interesting I should check in with some of the Scandinavian countries. I haven't dug into that in a while.
Great. And it's past top of the hour, so I'm going to do one more question and then we'll call it a day. In your chart of ice dating from 1985 showing the deep ice is diminishing, do we have data from before 1985 which shows it has been diminishing for a long time, or is the turning point for the deep ice 1985?
I'm not sure. I can't say as far as data quality going back pre-85. There will be ice coring, there will be things like that, but probably my guess is that because that study is like a conglomeration of other studies put together, that's as far as back as they could reach consistently as far as data to put in. So it's probably just more sporadic before 85. And 85 that time period doesn't actually represent the turning point. So the trend that we see there is continuing, and then the real shift that we see probably is actually the last 15, 20 years is where that actual big shift is happening. So yeah, it's just harder to visualize that pre-existing data. You can find the data sets for it though.
Okay, great. All right, ladies, that's it for questions today. Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us. I'm going to turn it back over to both of you for any closing comments you'd like to make, and we'll start with Kristina.
It was my pleasure to come in today, and thank you so much, Kendall and Eleanor. It was lovely to get to think about the bears and being up north again. For everyone listening, I sincerely hope you have the opportunity to see it in person someday. I know it's a huge part of, brings me a lot of joy and just, yeah, changes for the better. Eleanor?
I'll echo that as well. So thanks to all of you for attending today, and Kristina and Kendall for being here and getting all this information to everybody here. And I'll echo that and just say that there's not much more satisfying, I know for me, than to see an animal in its natural habitat, and to see a polar bear on the sea ice. If that's ever a chance that's something that you get a chance to do, it's really incomparable. So I wish that we all get to travel again very soon, and that we all get to go up and see those beautiful, beautiful white bears that we would like to see.
Absolutely. Thanks so much again, ladies. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can find this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.